Hello, everyone. My name is Stephanye Hunter. I'm the editor-in-chief of the University of Florida Press, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. I'm joined today by editors for our new UF Press series, Caribbean Crossroads, who will discuss their perspectives, goals, experiences, and recommendations for prospective authors. I want to thank the UF Center for Latin American Studies for their collaboration in making this session possible. So first, I have a few pointers and guidelines for the panel. The panel is being recorded. After the webinar, the recording will be available on the Press YouTube channel, and registrants will receive an email after the webinar with a link. Closed captioning has been enabled for this webinar. To view the closed captioning, please click on Closed Caption in your meeting controls. If you have a question for the panelists during the presentation, please put your question in the Q&A box. Questions will be addressed in the Q&A session after the presentation is finished. I would now like to welcome our panelists. Our first panelist is Dr. Lillian Guerra, who is a professor of history at the University of Florida and the author of several books, including Heroes, Martyrs, and Political Messiahs in Revolutionary Cuba, 1946 to 1958, and Visions of Power in Cuba, Revolution, Redemption, and Resistance, 1959 to 1971. Guerra's work on Cuban and Caribbean history has been supported by a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship, a John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship, and the American Council of Learned Societies Fellowship. Next, we have Dr. Devyn Spence Benson, who is an associate professor of history and African American and Africana studies at the University of Kentucky, and the author of Anti-Racism in Cuba, The Unfinished Revolution. Benson's research focuses on anti-racist movements in the 20th century, specifically concerning Afro-Cuban history, politics, and culture. Benson has held residencies at the Schomburg Center for Research and Black Culture and the W.E.B. Du Bois Research Institute at the Hutchins Center at Harvard University. Her current work is being sponsored by a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship. Next is April Mays. April is a professor of history at Pomona College, author of The Mulatto Republic, Class, Race, and Dominican National Identity, and co-editor of Transnational Hispaniola, New Directions in Haitian and Dominican Studies. Mays's research on the Dominican Republic and Haiti has been funded by a Rockefeller Foundation grant and a Fulbright Research Teaching Fellowship. Mays is a co-founder of the Transnational Hispaniola Collective, which promotes research and cross-national dialogue on the island. And finally, we have Dr. Solsiree del Moral, who is professor of American Studies and Black Studies and chair of the American Studies Department at Amherst College. Del Moral is the author of Negotiating Empire, The Cultural Politics of Schools in Puerto Rico, 1898 to 1952. She was also just named the 2023 Bacardi Family Eminent Scholar at the University of Florida Center for Latin American Studies. We're very excited about that. Del Moral's research, which focuses on Puerto Rico, the Circum-Caribbean, and U.S. colonialism, has received support from the American Council of Learned Societies, the American Association of Hispanics in Higher Education, and a Foreign Language and Area Studies Fellowship. Welcome, everyone. Next, the book series that we are here to talk about. Very excited about this new series, Caribbean Crossroads, Race, Identity, and Freedom Struggles. More than any other region of the Americas, the Caribbean has been continuously defined by the push and pull between global white supremacy and Black liberation, colonial and anti-colonial impulses, and the struggle for freedom against externally imposed economies and political systems. This series proposes to focus on these varied and contradictory histories of the region, with a particular focus on Cuba, Puerto Rico, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and their transnational ties. Importantly, books will explore the Caribbean as a racialized space and will not be afraid to name the ways whiteness and Blackness work in the region. We are dedicated to publishing projects based on fieldwork in Caribbean libraries, archives, homes, and streets that reflect local Caribbean from within experiences and viewpoints. Thus, books about Caribbean history, broadly defined, which may include some literature and anthropology, are welcome. All right, so we're going to have 3 questions to be discussed by our panelists, after which I'm going to open it up for question and answer. So please post any questions in the Q&A box. In the meantime, our first question for Devyn and Lily: why do we need this series?
Well, first of all, it was great that you called me and suggested it, Stephanie. I want to thank you for doing that. I don't know that I've ever been approached by an editor with such enthusiasm for the Caribbean in particular. I would say that there are two main reasons to have a series like this. The first is that most of us ascribe modernity when we study it, or we just think about it as average citizens, to really finding its origins in Europe. And in fact, modernity finds its greatest expression in the Caribbean when you define modernity as true and universal freedom. So it was people in the Caribbean who in the late 18th century launched a revolution to overturn all forms of racial hierarchy and to declare true equality. And that happened in San Duman. And it continued to happen across the Caribbean for decades until, in fact, freedom was truly achieved. So this notion that modernity really finds its origin in this universal, all-encompassing of humanity, understanding of freedom and our basic right to pursue dreams and to do so without chains. That's something we can attribute to the Caribbean. And I think the more histories we have of the Caribbean, not just for the 19th century, but especially for the 20th century, the more we can be convinced of the centrality of the Caribbean to other developments. I would include in that the development of the United States. I mean, without reference to the Caribbean, we cannot understand, no one can understand how the United States went from being the first place in the world to launch an anti-imperialist revolution to, in fact, being a place by the 20th century that was both the progenitor of this idea of anti-imperialism for the hemisphere, as well as, the new empire. The United States history and identity is based on a paradox of democracy being undermined from within by these ideas of empire. And those played out in the Caribbean very intensely. They continue to play out for those of us who are from there, and many of us who have had to move to the United States in order to survive the legacies of US colonialism and control, in particular by foreign investments, backed by the US military and multiple military occupations of many of our islands, including Cuba and that of Puerto Rico, where the US military occupation of 1898 became permanent, and where we still have millions of people who have no vote in Congress. They don't have the right to have representation of their interests at the level of Congress and have no path to even total inclusion politically as a state. And that just recently been reaffirmed by the Supreme Court last week. So effectively, there's so much that we can learn from the Caribbean, but mostly we need to understand that the Caribbean is central to world history, to European history, to American history, and that it stands on its own as a great contributor to the most basic ideals of humanity. A second reason I think that we need the series, which is less perhaps all-encompassing, is simply that I, as a person who started publishing in the 1990s, yes, I'm that old, have constantly had to fight to explain to editors and to my own colleagues that the Caribbean matters and why it matters. I think that we need books that are more cutting edge and that also have sharp edges to them. And in general, there has been, I think, a lagging of an effort on the part of the current publishing establishment, especially among university presses. There has been a lagging of an effort to make provocative books. There seems to be a diminishing of some of the dissertations, in fact, that I have read as dissertations once published into books, a diminishing of the provocative nature of the research and its implications. So there may be market reasons for that, but we don't care really to adjust ourselves to those reasonings. I think we have a lot of new people in this profession as well. And with that, I'll end my point. When I started off as a historian, as a would-be historian in the early 1990s, there were really no female historians who worked on the Caribbean, with the exception of Rebecca Scott and maybe a few others. But it was a mostly male world. And today I'm very happy to say that, particularly with regard to Cuba, the majority of historians and upcoming historians of Cuba are women. And that's astonishing. And it is the result of Rebecca Scott and Ada Ferrer and many other people, my own advisors, and it is a result of our own inclinations to radicalize as females the understanding of the world by bringing our perspectives to it and our voices to it, which for so long have been silenced deliberately and in other ways. Those are good reasons.
Yeah, those are great reasons. Thank you, Lily, for starting us off. So we'll also sort of all say that, why do we need this series? Like, after Stephanie calls Lily, Lily calls me. And I'm like, oh my goodness, how am I even getting into something like this? It feels like such a huge undertaking. But the more we talked about it, the more we realized how needed it was, how important the space that we want to carve out is, for all the reasons that Lily has said and all the reasons that we're going to share with you today. I think for me, one of the most important reasons that we need this series is something that has sort of been on my mind for a long time, and something that I talked about recently at a talk that I gave at the Cuban Research Institute conference at FIU. And the talk was titled Anti-Blackness in Cuban Studies. And I talked about the ways that in particular scholars have, what I thought that scholars need to do is they need to break away from this notion of racelessness that has been accepted. I would say that scholars have accepted just as much as people living in the islands have. Like this idea that we're not Black, we're not white, we're all Cubans, without recognizing, like, we have great books that show us that this idea of sort of Cubanidad that's non-racialized comes out of a particular historic moment, the need to unite former slaves and former slave owners for the wars from independence, that later it's pushed because of this idea of, like, we have to show that even though we're a mixed race society, that we're okay for self-government, that Cubans have built this type of Cubanidad for lots of reasons. And yet, even though we know it comes out of particular historical moments, so many of the books published about Cuba accept this idea and write as if Cubans don't have any races and they're just Cubans. And so when Lily approached me, I was like, I'll participate if we can craft a book series that's willing to see the Caribbean, the whole region, as a racialized space. If we can publish books that aren't afraid to name Blackness and whiteness, if we're willing to publish books that are going to say that we actually have to push the bounds, right? When we talk about sharp edges, that we want to say that we recognize that they're European standards of beauty, that they're European ideals, that this pursuit for whiteness is a part of every history that we publish. And that the anti-Blackness that has so long been a part of Caribbean spaces is also going to be front and center in those books. Now, that doesn't mean that every book in our series has to be about Black people. That's not what we're saying, right? Rather, what I'm asking, and I want to create a space in the series, is that all of these books will engage with the ways that race, racism, and racial privilege play a role in the histories that you're telling. So why do we need this series is because we're going to stand apart by the very fact that in the first line of our series description, we say white supremacy and Black liberation. And you don't see that in other book series about the Caribbean. And so I think for us, creating that space, one is one of the many reasons that we need this space. The second reason that I'm really excited about this series, and I'm glad that we're doing this, and I think we need this space, is that we want to create an opportunities for young scholars to come to us and bring manuscripts that don't have to be fully formed, you don't have to have it all right. We want to create a space where we're willing to mentor scholars, that we're willing to be a series editors that are going to work with you one-on-one to get your scholarship from where it starts off to where we need it to be. And that's because we have a commitment to mentoring. We have a commitment to mentoring scholars of color. We have a commitment to mentoring women of color. We have a commitment to mentoring all scholars, but really because we know that all of us both benefited from good mentorship. And then there were also times when we needed more mentorship. And so that's going to be a key part of what this series does, is that we're going to be willing to meet you where you are and work with you to create the best radical, cutting edge, sharp edges scholarship on the Caribbean. So we're excited to be here. We're excited to answer your questions. Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you both so much. Okay, question number 2 is for Solsiree and April. Why celebrate Caribbean history from that of Latin America?
You want to go first, April, or? So we're all historians here, and I think I'm going to build on some of the comments made by Lily at the beginning of the presentation. And I think the main reason to separate the Caribbean from Latin America, specifically the countries that we're discussing here in our description, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Dominican Republic, and Haiti, is that without attention to this region in particular, by definition, it becomes a marginal space. And it is not in any way marginal, as Lily explained earlier, in relationship to definitions of modernities. And so when the Caribbean is discussed in relationship to Latin America, at least the Spanish-speaking Caribbean and Haiti, it's always as how it's exceptional and different from the main narratives of 19th and 20th century histories of Latin America in particular, whatever the patterns may be about revolution, independence, nation building, etc. And so that does the disservice to the histories of these Caribbean countries and the people themselves, which are in no way marginal to anything. That comparison fragments the Caribbean. It tries to disintegrate what is really a comparative field of the Greater Caribbean in particular. And it divides up the region or fragments the region by language and histories of European colonialism, which does a disservice to the people of the Caribbean. Instead, a comparative Caribbean framework that centers the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Haiti in the discussion allows for exploring the ways that these Caribbean countries share a familiar history and overlap, a history that overlaps over different historical periods, whether in relationship to each other, like the Dominican Republic and Haiti, or Puerto Rico and Cuba, but also in relationship to the rest of the Caribbean region. And that may be political, economic, or cultural, but it is familiar and not marginal to Latin American history. That's the first thing I want to say. Now, specifically, if we're looking at these islands in the Caribbean, one of the initial reactions that you might have for the 19th and 20th centuries is that these Caribbean countries have really been impacted and defined by the presence of the United States as an empire, as a colonizing nation, both in response to military occupations or in response to anti-US nationalist revolutionary movements. And so each of these Caribbean nations indeed have been influenced by the US, but their response has been distinct, and that distinction needs to be analyzed on its own. So while we are all very familiar with the Cuban example of a radical, revolutionary, eventually socialist revolution that fought against the United States, we have the Puerto Rican example of colonialism and accommodation, and we have the Dominican example of the legacy of the US military in the Dominican Republic and dictatorship with Trujillo over generations. So on the one hand, these different examples deserve to be looked at independent of Latin American nations, independent to a certain extent of the US, but in relationship to each other. Beyond the knee-jerk reaction to the US presence in the Caribbean, however, and neocolonialism at the turn of the century, there are so many different ways that this Caribbean region is interconnected beyond the colonial histories of African slavery and the history of their descendants, and beyond the history of export commodity production. In the 19th and 20th centuries, we have a history of internal migration in the Caribbean. So for different reasons, workers migrate from one island to the other. And if we include the island of New York City as part of that Caribbean region and migration, we also have political movements, whether revolutionary or not, who are in conversation with each other. And so the internal dynamics of each of these Caribbean countries are significant on their own, standalone, but are really quite interesting in relationship to each other. And again, in no way are marginal to the master narratives of Latin American history. So what the series is doing is working with scholars who are trying to correct for that marginalization of Caribbean history in relationship to Latin America, but also centering the history of Spanish-speaking and Haiti, of Cuba, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico and Haiti in relationship to other Caribbean countries. And that itself is significant. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Sol. Thank you, everyone. My Wi-Fi has been a little bit shaky, so if I freeze, just give me a minute. I'll catch up, I promise. Also, there's so many friends in the room. Thank you all for coming. I'll call you out later. And I also, from Devyn's point of view, I got a phone call from these fabulous people and said, hey, what do you think about this? Do you want to join? And it's been an honor and such a privilege to work with these fantastic scholars, and also with Stephanie and Rachel, and kind of imagining and dreaming about this series and getting some work done. And I also just want to emphasize, before I launch into my answer to the question, why the Caribbean, Devyn's point about one of our main goals is to really mentor emerging scholars. And because I think all of us benefited from someone, not just mentoring, but literally taking our work and shepherding a project through. I absolutely benefited from that with Michelle Mitchell, publishing my first article about gender and in the Dominican Republic. And so I never forgot that gesture of generosity, but also just intellectual solidarity with her. It was wonderful. And I've always wanted to pay that forward. And so this series is giving us an opportunity to do that. Why the Caribbean? So I have a number of incoherent thoughts, but one thing I will say is, I'm too much on TikTok, admittedly, but one of the conversations that I see in the popular, if TikTok is any evidence of popular thinking, which is questionable, but I've seen these interesting conversations, are Haitians Latin American? And what does that say if we can't know that Latin America would not be Latin America without Haiti? So we have to ask the question if Haitians are Latin American, right? I'll also say that we are on the eve of a UN invasion of Haiti right now, right? A US intervention, if like the last one, MINUSTA, was headed by Latin American nations. Brazil, Chile, Uruguay sent soldiers to occupy Haiti, which leads me to ask, even as sometimes we want to forge this bond between Latin America and Caribbean studies, and many of us are in departments that say that in our language, we have a number of relations that really, and understandings that undermine that kind of sense of unity of purpose and unity of identity. And in a world where, as again, we will see what happens in Haiti in the coming weeks, where other global South powers or wannabe powers can work as proxies of the United States, Canada, France, the core group, and work to occupy Haiti, is there any wonder that maybe that we need to remain this sort of separate category outside of Latin American studies, and yet very also, as Sol was saying, intimately connected with the rest of Latin America. I'll also say that I am so excited because the scholarship that I am seeing from emerging scholars, particularly those of Caribbean diasporas in the United States, I'm thinking specifically of up-and-coming Dominican scholars, up-and-coming Puerto Rican scholars, they are writing the cutting edge and sharp edge scholarship, and they need a space. And they're doing that as diasporic peoples, but also people who have this transnational relationship. They've been, in many instances, going back and forth between islands of origin, or at least islands of origins for their parents and themselves. And again, that has a different, we want to provide the space for that new scholarship coming through. I'll also say, finally, working in this area of migration, I live in California, about a couple of hours from the US-Mexico border, and I've been working with a Haitian-led organization to work with Haitian migrants coming across. And if we are not in the room as an organization representing Black migrants don't get represented. Because of the ways that discourses around migration, narratives around the border are so overwhelmed by Mexican or Central American experiences, people forget that or don't acknowledge the ways in which African and African descended people have moved across these borders for centuries. That these borders, like borders in our own regions, have been Black spaces, anti-Black spaces, leveraged for both welcoming and terror. And if you're not in the room as who you are, your perspectives, but also your needs and requirements will not be addressed and will not be met. And so the anti-Blackness that Devyn mentioned earlier operates both as this sort of explicit, no, we want to exclude you and forget you, but also as this very implicit, you're not even there, right? And so I just want to, I think naming the Caribbean continues to be part of the project, and also thinking from the Caribbean is where we're headed to next. And I'll close with this statement about, so much of what we see in literary studies or anthropology has come from the Caribbean: hybridity, syncretism, reconstituted societies, peasantry, free peasantry. All these sorts of ideas have come out of Caribbean historical experiences. And let me also say, by the way, to be a Caribbean historian, you kind of have to also be an anthropologist, a literary scholar, an intellectual scholar, theoretician, and everything else. So history also is very interdisciplinary. But there are many things, many ideas, many axioms, many paradigms, many epistemologies that have come out of the Caribbean. Everyone uses the Caribbean, and yet the people and the people's understanding as a driving force in creating epistemologies and creating methodologies remains silenced in our disciplines and in the US Academy. And it's time to start thinking from Caribbean spaces. As I've argued in the books, thinking from Hispaniola out, thinking from Puerto Rico out. And in the age of climate crisis, we need to start doing that very intentionally.
Thank you. Thank you, Solsiree and April. That was great. All right. Our final question: what books do you hope to see in the series? And I'm going to go around and call on you. So let's go in the order that you talked previously. So Lily, do you want to go first? Oh, you're muted, Lily. There you go.
I forgot. I do hope that we recognize the great opportunities that the opening up of archives in the Dominican Republic, for instance, have represented, and the great difficulty of accessing material in Haiti, but that it is happening, or Haiti. And more books that would cover and really explore the tensions between those two nations, the taboos surrounding those tensions, the kind of crises that Haitians live with without relief, that come from these international interventions. I think that those would be really, really welcome. I know as well that there are some dissertations out there recently done, at least one of them, but definitely recently done, that really deal with the more recent U.S. military occupation of the Dominican Republic. To give an example, that happened in 1965 and had horrific repercussions for the death of democracy there for another few decades. Books that are really, for me, books that would be about the late 20th century, and that would cover a lot of these areas that are sort of in the dark for us. I know that for Puerto Rico, whenever I teach about Puerto Rican nationalism, or I teach about that military intervention I just mentioned for the Dominican Republic, post Trujillo, people don't know about this. They feel deprived. I mean, I have, in most of my classes that are about the Caribbean, have a majority of students who are either descended from Caribbean people or are themselves Caribbean, and they feel somewhat a sense of outrage that they haven't been taught this even by their own parents or their grandparents. And so this taboo history, which is so essential to explaining so much of the need for change in the Caribbean that has never gone away, and the ways in which the absence of change often, or the stopping of change, has had an impact in the United States. these things would be really wonderful to see represented in any way. I also think books that are written from within, you know, has been stated in various ways by scholars who have done research in the Caribbean, as opposed to in the U.S. National Archives. Those books have changed the entire way that we have perceived the region. And so, you know, Aline Helg, for instance, when she wrote her book in 1995 about the racial massacre, the Black massacre in Cuba in 1912, carried out by the Cuban government and hundreds of thousands of white Cubans. That book really marked you know, sort of a shift in so many ways, a paradigm shift in what it was possible to discuss, and how such essential myths of racelessness could as you know, as is very true of Cuba's history, racelessness, those myths could just immediately collapse under the weight of their fiction. And you know, there's not just one moment of such repression in Cuba or elsewhere. There are many. So I'm all about trying to highlight these kinds of themes, because I feel that when I teach about them, or when I myself try to write through them and research through them, you know, we need so much more. And so I look forward to receiving those kinds of works, and I'll pass it on to my colleagues, try to get out into the light, out of the light. Go ahead.
I want to, I'm like, I want to see all the books. I want to see the really, really good books. Like, we want to see the deeply researched books. I think Lily has talked about this, like the books that are going into new archives. But we all know that if you're writing books about people of African descent, sometimes all the materials aren't in the archives. So maybe you're using oral histories, maybe you're creating your own archives, maybe you're using family archives. Like, but we do want books that are deeply researched and just very full of all of the different ways of showing us whatever story it is that you're trying to tell us. I think we're also looking for books that are beautifully written. I mean, I'm fortunate to be sitting in a room with, you know, women who've written beautiful books. I think like April was saying, like, we all know that that doesn't happen overnight. So it's okay if right now it's not beautifully written. Like, part of the mentorship will be that we want to be there, but we want books that people are going to want to pick up and read. So deeply researched, sharp books that are also beautifully written. And I know I'm particularly interested in books about transnational ties. I do think that sometimes, especially the conservative view when people are advising students, is that, you know, you need to write on one country so you can be a specialist on one country. And like and then you take that book to the press as your dissertation, and the press is like, yes, we've got this one book on one country. But, you know, Caribbean folks live transnational lives, and we all know that. And that does sometimes require us to be deeply well-oriented in the histories of multiple places. And that's not always something you can accomplish in graduate school, but that can be something that can take a dissertation to a fabulous award-winning book by doing that. And I think that's really exciting to think about books that have transnational ties, both with the Caribbean and the United States, but also inter-Caribbean as well. So we're very excited about those books as well. Lily, I think you were going to add on.
Yes, you know, I want to. Yes, it's very quick, but I realized, you know, this week in my gender and sexuality seminar, we're reading Luisa Capetillo's recent translation of Luisa Capetillo's works. And so she was a Puerto Rican working class activist and one of the greatest and first feminist thinkers of Latin America. And you know, we need books like that. I mean, in fact, I would love to be able to teach some of these fabulous novels of the Caribbean that are only available in Spanish. So literary scholars who are out there and who can do translations and can think about what are the books that really would be transformative of the kind of discussion you can have about the Caribbean. Well, among them are these novels that were so impactful, could have wonderful introductions, could really make the novel fly. I mean, I would see that as also a really tremendous contribution. And to have them in English makes them very widely available to heritage speakers and to, you know, sort of transnationally in ways that we've never had before. So it would be a wonder to see some of those. And I'll be quiet now.
Solsiree? Oh, you're muted too, Solsiree.
Sorry about that. I think I would, at first I have to say I agree with everything, of course, that Devyn and Lily have said, and I would emphasize a couple parts of it. I think Devyn mentioned, well, I mean, maybe even earlier, I can't remember right now, but I would be especially interested in books about Puerto Rico and the Caribbean that center Blackness in particular. I think Puerto Rican scholarship and historians and Puerto Rican scholars have moved beyond the myth of racial democracy and maybe almost a generation ago. But that doesn't mean that we've had the opportunity to really look at the heterogeneous ways, the heterogeneity within the Black community in Puerto Rico, whether it's a 19th or 20th century question, or like a very, very recent question about gender and feminism in Puerto Rico is very much about the question of Blackness. So I think my first area of interest is like the diversity within Black communities themselves in the Caribbean, like that focus. And then the second thing I would say, which I think is repeating what, this is where Devyn comes in, is the transnationalism. In no way has Puerto Rico or any nation in the Caribbean or country in the Caribbean ever been bounded by national colonial borders. And so the Puerto Rican experience is always about migration in some way or another, migration of ideas, peoples, or anything else. And so I think Puerto Rican history books, the best ones that come forward, have to follow the people where they travel and not be bounded by by questions of the nation. Of course, that requires working in multiple archives, or it requires doing oral histories or life stories. It's a different way of doing the work, but I think it will be important to support scholars who are highlighting this type of transnational history and relationship within the Caribbean and from the Caribbean to the US. So I think those are my two areas of interest. Absolutely.
I would have to say, so I still, even though some of my work has gone into the 20th century, I still consider myself very much a 19th century person, because the 19th century is the most important century in human history. And for that reason, I just want to see a lot more about the 19th century Caribbean social history, socioeconomic history. One of the ongoing conversations, so a lot of people talk about the Haitian Revolution and then U.S. occupation in Haiti in 1915. I'm like, oh, there's a lot of history between 1804 and 1915, and that we're uncovering even as we speak. So I'm particularly interested in that. The opening up or digitization of archives, especially out of Spain, actually, has opened up opportunities for more research in colonial era. So I'm thinking, even late 15th, 16th century Santo Domingo, or what would have been the colony. So that would have been all of the island. And I was just at a conference where someone mentioned, there are lots of archives in the Canary Islands that people haven't used. And as much as we know about Canary migrations to the Caribbean as well, there's going to be a wealth of information there also as a site of sort of like the first kind of plantation model, the template that then gets moved over to the Caribbean. Also, we need folks who are working in Danish archives. There are 3 islands that are US Virgin Islands now, but they haven't always been. They were under Denmark. And so I am interested in research and scholarship that's looking at those communities, enslaved communities. Also, there's records of many slave rebellions and revolts on the US Virgin Islands. Again, are people who's looking at that, and how can that be? And also from a Dominicanist and Haitianist perspective, so many people politically exiled themselves to St. Thomas over the years, right? And so we know that those islands were in people's mental geographies and political geographies as well. And I would love more exploration of that. And I think also the political trajectories of various movements, particularly out of the 18th and 19th century Caribbean. I'm thinking of Antianismo, but also, where Antianismo met up with kind of some of the universalist projections of the Haitian Revolution and its consequences, and then also met up with, you know, Spencerianism, evolutionary thinking, you know, reorganizing societies towards the end of the 19th century. These are all for Dominican Republic, Haiti, Puerto Rico. These are all questions in Cuba of the moment that would combine history, perhaps anthropology, political history, intellectual history, as well. And then finally, we make a lot of assumptions about, building on Solsiree's point, we make a lot of assumptions about how people think they're Black, how Black people think of themselves as Black, right? You know, like, you know, it's funny to me how Haiti is like the Black Republic, and yet I can't think of works that have really focused on Blackness in Haiti. How do people in Haiti think about and operate with Blackness, right? And so that's a kind of project that can be both sort of a national, have national orientation, or be done in this sort of transnational way. But I'm also thinking about Jamaica. Jamaica, for its size, has given the world a lot. And there are Jamaicans in a lot of these spaces, right? And the connections between, say, Haiti and Jamaica, because they're so close, that you have this back and forth migration as well. And can we talk about how perhaps even internally within the Caribbean, as Sol was saying, that there are these kind of racial formations that happen inside the Caribbean that change perspectives around Blackness and race in spaces that are also can be quite different. So in Jamaica, you have the added of Indian communities and Chinese communities as well. So their racial formation is kind of in relation to these other communities, with a huge national thrust towards out of many one people, which sounds a lot like racelessness in Cuba, which sounds a lot like racial democracy everywhere else, right? So those transnational conversations being really at these local levels, and following people on boats when they could get around the Caribbean. I mean, Laura Putnam has a wonderful article that really, I think, critiques and also makes us think about what it means with digitization to now be able to follow people across so many spaces, and where the archival work, right, the digging deep, what happens to that kind of archival labor? But it has been really impressive to see what folks have been able to do because records are digitized, because of access to things like ancestry.com, and you can track people's movements. We're at a really interesting time, and let's take the leadership on that.
Thank you, everyone. We have some excellent questions coming in, so I'm going to dive right into the Q&A. The first question is from a professor whose students are watching this class. She says, one of my students was wondering if you could expand on the idea of anti-Blackness, particularly as it pertains to the Caribbean region. Is the experience of BIPOC people different if they are from the Caribbean region? And I think, Devyn, you're going to take the lead on this one.
I can certainly start the conversation. That's a great question. First of all, thank you all students who are here, who are with us today. We're really excited, and we're excited that you're asking questions. Yes. So that's a really great question to start us off with. I think when I was talking about anti-Blackness, I was talking in particular about the field of Cuban studies, because I was talking about the ways that, you know, how many manuscripts do I receive where people are just writing about Cubans? Cubans this, Cubans that, Cubans this, and they're using a particular set of archival sources. And it's very clear to me that they're writing about white Cubans. And I'm like, okay, then why can't you say that you're writing about white Cubans? Like, I need you to name that. Even if you don't say it every time, I need you to at least start off saying that this is what this is representing, and that these other experiences of Black and mixed race Cubans might be different, might be similar, might look different ways. So I was particularly talking about the field there. But to go in more specifically about the ways that anti-Blackness works in the Caribbean region, is I think it's important for us to recognize that race and racism shape, shift, and look different everywhere they go. And at the same time, that anti-Blackness tends to be a thread that runs throughout all of these spaces. So as someone who's from the United States, like, I know that race and racism look different if I'm in New England versus if I'm in the South, versus if I'm in Texas, versus if I'm in California. Like, I'm called different things in different places. People interact with me in different ways. Like, race and racism look differently in all different places. And yet overall, there tends to be a thread of anti-Blackness. The same can be said for the Caribbean and Caribbean spaces and spaces in the Caribbean diaspora. And so we're looking for books And we want research that's going to go into those localities, that's going to look at how anti-Blackness is functioning in this particular place where you're doing your research and how it looks as versus, and maybe it looks different somewhere else. But I do think that even as we say that those experiences of racism for Caribbean folks are different, right, and are different in many ways, I do think there should still be an attention to that. How is anti-Blackness affecting that? Because in most spaces, in former colonial societies, in former slave societies, we do know that anti-Blackness is a strong thread that hasn't been fully dealt with.
Thank you, Devyn. Anyone else want to chime in? Okay, we have a couple of questions. Oh, go ahead, Solsiree.
Well, I mean, I just want to make sure that I defer to Devyn on this topic as her area of specialty. And I just wanted to add something really quickly. I know we have lots of questions. In terms of what BIPOC experiences in the Caribbean and the US and how they're different, I just wanted to say that in terms of the books that we would be interested in or the discussion about anti-Blackness, that there are two frameworks or contrasts that we want to move beyond. And one, of course, is the first argument that Latin American or Caribbean countries are raceless and harmonious, especially when compared to the US Jim Crow stereotypes. We have to move beyond that and see anti-Blackness and racism as part, as Devyn said, of a spectrum in the Americas and the hemispheric Americas for African and African descended peoples. I mean, that affect the experience of African and African descended peoples. And I also want to say that because the Caribbean, people in the Caribbean are travelers and migrants, they contribute to and are victims of anti-Blackness within the US, but in particular, because of proximity, anti-Blackness within Latinx communities or Latin American immigrant communities. And so it's different, but it's familiar. The way that you can assert it and confirm it will vary depending on the framework. But anti-Blackness, like Devyn said, is foundational to our understanding of Caribbean histories and the Caribbean experience in the region and in the US. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Solsiree. Okay, next set of questions is about kind of the scope of the series. So I'm going to read a couple of them maybe, and we can kind of discuss more largely. Question, I am so excited about this series and understand the privileging of manuscripts on the Spanish Caribbean, given your expertise. I wonder whether there is interest to receive a book projects on marginal spaces within the Caribbean. For example, Caribbean coastal spaces of Central America or Western Caribbean spaces that straddle Anglo and Hispanophone spaces. And a related question, could you elaborate further on what space would be non-Hispanic Caribbean other than Haiti, circum-Caribbean in the series? And that person also said congrats to a dream team of editors, which I would like to echo that you all are in fact my dream team. Go for it, Lily.
Well, I teach a class called the Black Caribbean that is Haiti, Jamaica, Dominican Republic, and coastal Nicaragua. And I've been teaching that class since 2004. It was and is my favorite class because the materials I can use for it have increased exponentially, and the quality of the writing about these different countries has just it's expansive. You know, it's not just better or differently researched. It's just better. There's so much more. So the mosquitoes are there because they are exactly what you're talking about. That person who asked this question, they are a community that existed independently of national frameworks and were not entirely colonized. They were protected, quote unquote, by the British. And they developed an entire culture and an economy that managed to survive until really the end of the 19th century, when the nation state of Nicaragua and US surging imperialism eliminated the possibilities for resilience politically and economically. So this community has this really great story that is a reality of how within the region you have fugitive slave communities, you have communities that were at one point, well, like Dominica, which has a surviving indigenous population that seems to have regrouped in the first 100 years after the Holocaust of the first 50 years of the conquest. So from 1492 to about the 1550s, you have just demolition of indigenous communities, in part through enslavement. And so Dominica, is a place it's not on the margins of, I don't think margin is like a good word. In general, because then if this doesn't serve us, because in fact, when you look at what might be a micro history, like an island like Dominica, or you look at the Mosquito in Nicaragua, you end up understanding the macro histories better and more deeply because of the ways in which these small places or these apparently marginal, quote unquote, experiences and struggles completely reshaped the dynamics at a larger level, and then also represented the dynamics that could be applied and the patterns that could be applied elsewhere. So, I think we are looking for the values that we have in this, vested in this series, could be applied to virtually any location in the Caribbean, so long as the work is very well done, readable, either archivally based or differently archivally based, and that sets forth truths in new ways and original ways. That I wouldn't be exclusive. I wouldn't say that we're just working on the Hispanophone plus. I think that the Caribbean has to be understood much more broadly than something as simple as a linguistic barometer. Those and I think the term marginal is not part of our vocabulary. So that's what I would say.
Anyone else want to answer? Okay. The next set of questions, I'm going to focus on the mentoring aspect. Several of you mentioned that, which I really appreciated. That's an important component of the series. And we've had a couple of people ask for more information about that. One question, I'm so thrilled to hear about the mentorship component and the focus on emerging scholars of color. I would love to hear more about how the editors envision cultivating an how you plan to do that. And then another question, Dr. Mays mentioned her own mentorship experience. How do you see that working practically between the series editors and the authors? So anyone want to start?
I guess I'll start. So, yeah, some of it, the training comes when you experience it yourself, and then you think about what I didn't get in the process. And then, hopefully that's what you offer to other people. So some of it is, so I don't have graduate students. I work at an undergraduate institution. So my relationship to this is going to be different than my colleagues who have graduate students, and those graduate students are networking, and connecting with other people. And so there's a way that information circulates to you. But so I, the mentoring that happens for me is often I will receive an email from somebody that the last couple of weeks I have not been able to answer, but I will be able to answer after the first week of November. And so part of it is just kind of being welcoming and receptive to those emails, answering questions. And then the practicality of it is actually guiding people through the process, because this process is really weird. And it takes a lot longer than I think some people think. So I also want to have conversations with emerging scholars around what's your strategic plan? What point is this hitting you at your career? Are you tenure track? Are you not? Are you in a postdoc position? Are you instructing? Can we make the goals kind of into more bite-sized pieces and give ourselves little victories? So what can be published as an article? Can we aim for a contract, then work on the fuller manuscript later? It's about, reading people. And I think Devyn said it beautifully, starting where people are, because I also think And I said these to my students, my undergraduates, you know, who write senior theses, and often they're stuck because they want to write like the people they've read. And I have to remind them, those folks are old, you know, right? They've been doing this for a long time, and they have editors, and they work with a team, and they've gone through lots of revisions, and they've done this, right? So your first thing is not going to look like this. It's not going to sound like them, because this is a many year process. And so I think just by breaking it down into its component parts and being with someone each step of that way is really how I envision, at least, mentoring, but also being clear and transparent and honest and ethical in the treatment of manuscripts, right? Letting you know what looks very promising, how strong the arguments are, how persuasive, and where work needs to happen as well. But I think as long as people have a sense of where the end goal is and how long it's going to take them and we're as realistic as possible about that, then, you know, I think that really helps the entire process.
Thank you, April.
April, thank you so much for taking that, because you're really talking about like the relationships we were going to create. And I didn't know, Stephanie, do you want to say more about like how we're actually going to pair people up? Or I could take a shot at it. I feel like everybody's going to get to work with one of us. That's what I remember us deciding.
Yeah.
But I think there's more to it than that.
Yeah, so that's a good segue. The next question I was going to ask is about the process itself. So I'll kind of go into that a little bit. The way that we've kind of been talking about this is each project that we decide, you know, will be a good fit for the series will kind of get paired with a series editor, the most appropriate series editor. And it'll really be ideally a one-on-one partnership working directly between the series editor and the author, with me as the press editor, on, you know, as part of that. That will be probably the development part if needed. Some manuscripts may not need that extra development stage. All manuscripts are going to be peer reviewed. So we will do at least 2 external peer reviews in addition to a series editor peer review. And that's the way that the press operates. And we're going to continue doing that for the series. If those reviews do have significant suggestions for revision, then we would likely do a revise and resubmit and then send it back out for another round of peer review. But during that process, which is, you know, a very standard process for any university press, you have these 4 amazing scholars who are there to provide suggestions, provide support, and that's really meant to be one of the goals of this series. Did you want to say more beyond that, Devyn?
I was just going to say thank you for that, because I think that's what I wanted us to highlight, is that part of this will be that you'll get to work with one of us. I mean, that doesn't mean you couldn't talk to more than one of us if you felt like you wanted to, but you'll be paired with one of us to sort of work with while you're developing it if it needs that. And then once we get the readers' reports, you're not going to be left on your own to figure them out. The one of us will also be working with you to sort of talk through that and figure that out as well. And then I really do want to emphasize what April said about like us wanting to act with integrity, that we're not going to try and draw people along or drag people along or make it seem like we're going to publish your book and then not publish your book. Like, we've all been there. You've got to publish a book to get tenure, right? If you're in a tenure track position, or if you're looking for a job and you need to publish a job because you've been publish your book because you've been in a visiting position. Like, we're going to try and make those decisions and let you know what's happening and be as honest and transparent as we can be throughout the process, so that you can feel like you're moving towards the professional goals that you have.
Go for it, Lily.
So as someone who's received many rejections over the years, and I've published 5 books. I got the 5th one coming out in January. So, you know, I've had some success, but it's hard. One of the things that I have encountered, both as a recipient of the negative stuff, and as somebody who has seen works that get rejected by a journal or they get rejected by a press, that really just needed like one chapter to be completely revised. I would like those who decide to send their material to us, to send their manuscripts to us, that they would know that they can't ask, they can ask anything really, you know, that if they get a negative reader's report, the anonymity of the reader remains. But if they feel like something is an unfair judgment of their work, there's no reason why they couldn't have a conversation with me if I'm the one assigned to the book about why they think the author thinks it's an unfair judgment and how I would read that judgment in relationship to my understanding of the book. I think when you are a first-time publisher and you have had to satisfy a dissertation committee, there's a certain traumatizing element to that process that I remember well. And it's kind of hard to leave behind these things that you have now internalized as necessary. And so it can be sometimes re-traumatizing to encounter another set of readers who would have the opposite view, and tell you, no, you don't need to have an introduction that's 45 pages long, and you don't need to walk us through all the historiography, and you don't need to give us a chapter outline in the introduction. And these dissertation equalities to books make them far less readable in most cases. And it's hard for first-time authors to leave behind these patterns or these structures that they have been told so many times that they have to have. So I think, when Devyn says transparency, that to me translates to the kind of efforts that I would make to develop a sincere relationship with an author so that they can understand, why something needs work. And why and how much time, the other question that always most authors don't want to ask is how much time do you think it should take me to do this? Because they fear that their life reality might not live up to the need. And so they thereby want to avoid having to discuss that. And I think that that's one of the best things you can discuss. And in my own life, when I was publishing my second book, I got a reader's report that was 15 pages long and had all of these demands. And I had a wonderful editor named Elaine Maisner who said to me, well, this reader thinks it's going to take you 5 to 6 years to make these changes. How long do you think it'll take you? And I said 5 to 6 months. And she said, let's do it. And she kept on me, 1.5 months later, she was writing me. She didn't write, she called, which is a wonderful thing too. So, I wasn't devastated because she did ask me and she told me these things. And I'll never forget that. I think that's, now that Elaine is also retiring from UNC Press, I think she's left in her wake a lot of us who have had kind of training experiences on the other side of it. And with her and perhaps with other editors that we would like to emulate. And certainly that's one aspect that you should not fear as an author, being clear about asking what are our expectations, and then being clear about what your possibilities are and discussing those things. And, by phone, now by Zoom, is sometimes better than trying to do this over email. And I think that makes, putting that out there, I think matters to me at least.
Thank you, Lily. Yes, I agree entirely. You mentioned something about the writing style, and I kind of wanted to come back to that about making the books accessible. One of the questions is, will the series include publications focused on students? I teach Caribbean history every year, and it's hard to find accessible materials for students like mine, who may be very motivated and interested in the material, but who struggle with the prose of monographs oriented towards scholars. Wondering if you might say a little bit about that. Sure, whoever.
Oh, sorry. Well, I completely agree with that person. I think that I get a lot of students in my classes who want to write a research paper, or they must write a research paper. And then I get students who are just at the very basic level, entry level Latin American history. And they both have the same problem, which is they don't read Spanish. They have a hard time with the secondary source density. But they're very committed to the subject, and they're actually very skilled people. So one of the things that we could do to resolve that is to have more document collections that are great. I don't mean mediocre. I mean really good document collections that kick some butt, and forgive my lack of academic prose there, or I guess discourse. But something that is really exciting, and we have a lot of really good document collections that are on colonial Latin America. I mean, I'm still using, 1998 William B. Taylor and John Chastain's, document collections, because those things are, if you look at those examples, I think that would be something that I don't believe we have yet for the Caribbean. And I personally don't want to see these giant, readers, document readers. I don't want, no. We don't need this huge thing. We need something that's smaller, that has really sort of emblematic kinds of documents in there that get a conversation going, that might include imagery. We haven't had a good book on that includes great political cartoons in decades. And there are things like that, photography, not just texts, but objects, things that can be discussed and understood as themselves archival in the stories they convey and the questions that they ask. So I would love to see something like that. And it would be exactly attuned to a more introductory class, or to students who just aren't turned on or maybe capable at a certain stage of their career to getting through much more dense kinds of academic writing. Okay, and I promise now I'll just be quiet.
Anyone else want to say something about that? Okay, my next question is the subject area. Is the series going to publish books on subjects beyond history? If so, what other themes? And the person says, thanks for this incredible and much needed work.
I'll start and just say yes. Like, I think the quick answer should be yes, that I think April suggested earlier that we have to think about history as interdisciplinary. I think, again, when we're talking about people of African descent in the Caribbean, that there's a good chance that we're not only going to be able to use a particular type of traditional archive that you maybe think about for history, that you're going to use literature and film, and that you're going to bring in oral histories, that you're going to bring in lots of different types of sources in order to do a really rich telling of the story that you want to tell. So disciplinary, interdisciplinary, things that are using alternative sources outside of sort of your traditional archives. I'm open to all of those things. I think what's important is that it makes a great intervention, that it sticks with the themes and the goals of the series, and that it's really doing that sort of cutting edge, sharp edge scholarship that's attuned to anti-Blackness that we've talked about.
But is there anything really beyond history? Let us think.
Isn't everything actually history?
Exactly. I'm not disagreeing with Devyn, by the way. I totally agree. I'm also interested in histories of social sciences out of the Caribbean. So the way I teach my Afro-Latin America class, for example, is as a history of the anthropology about people of African descent in the Americas. And so students, we read everybody and then we read case studies, but we're actually grappling with how in the world did these questions emerge in the first place? And what were they supposed to do? And how these questions change from the 30s to the 40s to the 50s to the 60s. We got to do more stuff, the history of modernization theory, the history of development theory, because again, the Caribbean has been marked so much by these ideas and plans, and everyone's got a blueprint and no one's listening to the people. I mean, and that right there brings up the Cold War. Again, the Cold War Caribbean is not something that's been really focused on. I mean, and Lillian, in sort of the overview, we kind of mentioned it, but so there are also ways of doing histories of things that I think would be very compelling in a series that also centered questions of Blackness and anti-Blackness in the construction of these very categories of analysis, right? That have become so much of what we define as Caribbean studies, but also elevating and sort of centering Caribbean folks in those movements. I mean, Ostos, just to name one person, right? Among many, and to actually see the Caribbean as an intellectual space that produces epistemologies and knowledge production, right? I think that that's also a gap, kind of fulfilling Triot's no more the savage slot. This is the area that generates knowledge about our world and our realities.
Thanks, April. All right, next question. Curious to hear more on how folks conceive of the importance and role of digitization and archival labor and the imperative to center Blackness in new books. You wanna take a stab, Lily?
Okay. Okay, I'm just going to say this because, you know, in fact, the University of Florida has been a big champion of digitizing materials. Judy Russell, the Dean of Libraries, made this her goal when she arrived here more than a decade ago. And in fact, you know, the Digital Library of the Caribbean, which is now in some ways being restructured so that its accessibility will be more transparent and more you know, easier to work with. That has been a major resource for people in the Caribbean. And to our surprise, you know, the numbers of folks from, you know, the University of the West Indies using the Digital Library of the Caribbean is sometimes greater than, perhaps for their own reasons and geography, and but sometimes greater than what we get here, you know, and yet that is one resource to name, because the more pressure, in fact, we put on those librarians who are working to improve accessibility, the more they will pay attention, because it means a lot to them. And it has been difficult to make it more accessible. And it's mainly because the platform that it was on was about to fold. And so they had to reconstruct the platform just a couple of years ago. So that said, among the materials that have increased our ability and awareness of Blackness as not just a central theme, but as an organizing principle to identity in Cuban history, are films. And the number of films that have become available made after 1959 has increased simply because of the technology and facilitating access. And this is not, you know, the Cuban government's Film Institute making everything accessible. It's, you know, going nuts and trying to make, you know, and they're not really into information sharing at the Communist Party, and nor in any of its agencies. However, in Cuba, there has been an extraordinary effort on the part of certain individuals to digitize films and to give them away to scholars like myself and others. And they include films made by Sara Gomez, Devyn Benson being an expert on her work, Nicolásito Guillén-Landrian, who I've written about extensively in the past. And I have just given 140 films to the University of Florida to put into some kind of an accessible a collection that would be probably available to consult on site if we don't have copyright to distribute broadly. But a lot of it will be streamed, and that will also include a lot of films made before 1959. So there, you know, things like film are a new area for the Caribbean, not because they didn't exist, but because sometimes, you know, the technology in a location made it impossible, or the absence of technological improvements and the climatic conditions and the poverty made it impossible for things to be preserved, for things to be made available in a more efficient manner. But so film is a real big area that I would say we are now able to exploit, to really understand, in order to grasp new dimensions of our identity and our history. And I think that the digital humanities in general, it continues to be something that is going to benefit and is benefiting scholars and students of interest of the Caribbean, perhaps proportionally more so than other people interested in other parts of the world.
I'll just add to that, there's some incredible work in music as well. And also, has anyone checked out the Duke University Radio Haiti Lab? That contains the archives of the entire radio broadcast of, now I'm forgetting his name, but definitely important and certainly needs to be in any conversation about digital archives. And then on a recent trip to New Orleans, I was kind of amused, but you know, like old school, the Smithsonian collections, those CDs, there were a lot of folks who went out in the Caribbean and like recorded an amazing amount of artists, and the Smithsonian has a bunch of those. A lot of that sometimes is already out in CDs. Some of it is still in people's houses. I know also in the Dominican Republic, the oral history, but also, again, audio collections and audio files have been increasingly made available, as well as there's been a lot more support for gathering more audio information, just recording and saving an audio archive. And so again, as I think we've all mentioned, there's also a need to think differently about archives. And in the Caribbean, we have been thinking differently about archives for a very long time. So that's not new. I just think, again, kind of the seriousness with which scholarship based on oral, audio, visual, film, archives, right, it depends on who the publisher is. And we would create certainly a space for that.
Thank you both. We have another question from a student, which I'm loving these student questions. So this student is curious about scholarship on countries like Guyana and Suriname, who are culturally Caribbean, even though they are in South America and not located on the Caribbean Sea. Does this impact how these countries are represented in books about the region? How are these countries perceived in the current scholarship, inclusive in the region, or something else?
Well, I'll jump in to say my experience has been, and this kind of goes back to the other question about the sort of rimlands question of Central America and Northern and Colombia, Panama, Ecuador. So spaces within those countries are viewed as Caribbean and then kind of written off the national narrative. They're just not included in the national narrative. And like those spaces and like also the countries that we're talking about, there may be great work on slave society, 16th, 17th, 18th, well, mostly 17th and 18th century, Suriname or Guyana, maybe until emancipation. But then after emancipation, interestingly enough, sort of the anthropologists take over, right? Because now the question is about survivals and retentions, maroon societies and cultural change and acculturation, transculturation, like all those themes sort of kind of almost take over from the historical question. So the kind of exclusion happens, I think, interestingly, as we think about it from disciplinary perspectives. Sort of some of those places get anthropologized more than historicized, right? At particular moments in their chronologies, and we have to ask why and what work does that do? And then at the same time, because they're already imagined as more Caribbean, but I would argue, well, then what about Brazil? Wouldn't Brazil be more Caribbean than the other South American countries on some level as well, right? Predominantly almost majority Black population, reconstituted society. I mean, we can go on, but that the sort of imagined as a Caribbean space kind of writes them off in their own sort of South American history, as even though we want to connect it, and it might make sense to connect it to the Caribbean for these other historical reasons, the question remains, what does it mean that South America can't be Caribbean, right? In a certain way, in terms of its own racial formations, its own historical, right, experiences, not all of them, but some of them. Because, again, the South America, you have the Andes, you have large indigenous populations. So that makes it different, right? Very meaningfully different. And so what ends up happening is that those regions are kind of unknowable, illegible, confusing. Are they Caribbean? Are they South American? And because they kind of fall into these gaps, they don't often get picked up in the academy. And there's, again, scholars, but where they can be is histories of enslavement. That makes sense, right? Because that's where sort of Black people are. That's kind of the transatlantic conversation. And then after that, they make sense in anthropology. And so then we have a lot of those anthropological studies, but there's the bridge between the two. I think, if you're trying to do something a little different, you're going to find yourself on the outs, and unfortunately, falling into another kind of marginalized space. We don't want to use marginal, I'm sorry. But a gap that's been created by the way we've constructed our disciplines and our interest in these areas, in addition to regional and nationalist ideologies that erase Caribbeanness from their own narratives.
Lily, did you want to add
Let me
something?
say, yeah, I just want to remind everybody that the description of the series really tells you what we mean by Caribbean. And we're not guided by national borders or by the fact that Trinidad and Tobago were mostly in the Anglo imperial world, something like that. No, we're guided by the notion that this is the region of the Americas that's most consistently and intensely shaped by imperialism, by slavery, and therefore by genocide. And so, you guide yourself by that, you know what we're talking about. We're not talking about Paraguay, right? And I think that we should turn you back to you, Stephanye. But we should look at our series description, those of you who are interested, and see if what you are studying, what you want to write about directly fits that description. And I think you'll find that it is very broad. It's not narrow. The only guideposts we have in terms of expertise are those that we represent in our own scholarship. Cuba, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, and Haiti. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing that back, Lily. I wanted to conclude the webinar with some information on how scholars could submit to the series. If you are interested in submitting to the series, you can contact any of us, any of the 4 series editors or me. We're going to be posting the series description and my contact information in the chat. Please reach out to us if you think your book might be a good fit. If you have some questions, we're happy to talk to you. You can also find our submission guidelines, the press submission guidelines on our website, and those are going to be posted in the chat as well. I wanted to thank Lily, Devyn, Solsiree, and April for such an amazing conversation and for being the dream team. So excited about this. And thank you to the U.S. Center for Latin American Studies for their collaboration on this webinar. Just a reminder, a recording of this webinar will be available on the YouTube channel Florida Press, and a link to the recording will be sent out to all the registrants next week. And if you want to receive updates about books in the series and other books published by the University of Florida Press, you can visit our website. That's going to be posted in the chat, and sign up for our email list in the subject of Latin American and Caribbean Studies. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and I hope you all have a great week.